hands-on bodywork now for over 30 years, and I started teaching my technique, the Bowen technique, over 25 years ago as well. And when I started out in this industry, I came from, well, I was still in the catering industry. I was a chef. And I worked with my hands from a young age, and learning to feel changes as I was cooking, and knowing things were changed, and when to stop and when to keep going. So for me, the transition to bodywork, where essentially I felt it was the same thing, the same process, was relatively straightforward. You did things and felt things change underneath your hands. So along the way, to get qualified, I had to learn anatomy. But for me, it was sort of a hoop that I was jumping through. It felt disconnected. What I was learning from the anatomy books didn't seem to relate to what I was feeling, or even when I saw people moving around or being in pain, the problem, the disconnect between the anatomy and what I was doing seemed to get worse. And I felt that someone might hold themselves or move in a certain way, and I could see that. And I felt that that was influencing or maybe even causing a problem that they were presenting with, even though it might have been, the pain might have been a different part of the body. And so I felt really conflicted. Was this right? Was I imagining it? And if it was right, then surely it would be in the books, yeah? I mean, surely somebody would have written this down. And if it wasn't, well, who was I, a nothing, a nobody with no qualifications or background in this field, to see something that other people didn't see? But it sort of persisted, and I'd go to the anatomy books and I'd try and work it out, but it just didn't seem to join up. I knew the names of the structures I was working on, but what was going on didn't really work for me. So over the years, anatomy study, and I'm still keen on the subject, it took on new technology. There was apps and computer programs, and I went out and bought the lot, and where I could afford to. And I still do to this day, but it just seemed a sort of a rehash, a representation of the same stuff that was in the books. And what was in there didn't translate to the stuff that by this time I knew was real, and it wasn't there. Anatomy wasn't a way to help me understand what I was doing. It was a thing to learn. It was a subject, and it didn't relate to the people I was putting my hands on or the results I was getting. If I didn't get results with somebody, when I found something, under my hands, anatomy wasn't a tool that I could turn to that would give me any answers. So when I started to teach, I kind of found this thing happening again. I'd sort of put it to one side a little bit, but I felt I needed to explain what was happening and why I thought it worked in ways that were anatomical, and I had to know the anatomy. But for me, it was more of a reference about the locations of working rather than as a deeper understanding of what I was doing. Now, you have to understand, I didn't come from a background of being an academic. I never went to university or studied anything formally. I got my catering qualifications. And so everything I knew was from my own hands and what I taught myself, and the anatomy I taught myself along the way. And then it was really the sort of the light bulb moment was when I attended a human dissection class for the first time. And I realized that all the anatomy books that I've been studying left hugely important and massively key aspects out altogether. There was just nothing there. And all the stuff I saw in that class and I felt with my hands was what I knew I needed to know for my hands-on practice. And there wasn't a book out there, an anatomy book, that was going to teach me that. Even with that, I was still learning dissection from people who were brilliant anatomists and dissectors, but they didn't really have a peg to hang it on. They weren't working with people day in, day out and seeing and feeling them change under their hands or assessing their movement. They were either trying to prove their own theories or in some instances create stories about what it was they were dissecting. And that was great, but it was still a bit of a step into something else. The classical anatomists in the universities that I started to meet and get to know, I realized that they can know every name of every structure in the body, but most of them know little, sometimes even nothing about the human condition. You can point at somebody moving around and they have no idea what you're talking about. Some of them will have medical, the anatomy teachers in universities will be medical practitioners or surgeons, and they might be able to translate their anatomy into the knowledge of that and vice versa. But nobody has really ever come at it backwards, effectively, which is what I've done. So I came to dissection trying to find answers to what I was already doing, not from the perspective of learning anatomy and then teaching anatomy. So as a result, every time I go into a dissection lab, I get more of an insight into what it is that we're doing when we move and massage, touch and manipulate, as well, most importantly, as an insight into what we're definitely not doing. I take questions and I take those into the lab. So anybody can show you a dissection, but unless it's done from the perspective of a body worker, it just becomes another exercise in anatomy or someone telling you a story. So around 2007, I started my own classes in the UK and around the world, and I've been bringing dissection, bringing the dissection experience, bringing therapists into the room, and their experience has changed massively the way that they think, not just about the human body, but about the treatments that they do. Anatomy, breaking it down, comes from two words. Ana and tomi, and they literally mean, the words meaning cut and up. So literally, anatomy means cut up, and that's what happens. The body's cut into parts, and then they're studied and learned, and no one really puts those pieces back together again. And you know what? It's been like this for hundreds of years, and it's still like this today. So my approach in the dissection is, as I said, it's sort of coming at it backwards. And so rather than thinking about the parts, I put the body back together, strangely enough, and come at it from the whole. And this way, it allows you to see things that you'll never see in a book, and not even in a dissection. And more importantly, comes at it from the perspective of a body worker. As far as I know, I'm the only body worker in the world who is dissecting and explaining what he's working on from that perspective. So as well as that, I still teach bodywork, I still see clients, and I relate everything I see in the dissection back to the most important part, which is that of making treatments way more effective and building the confidence in the hands-on therapist. So I want to show you a little bit about what I mean about what's missing, and how we can take some of this sort of theoretical knowledge or understanding of what's under our hands and apply that into a session. So we often talk about when we're massaging, or we talk about muscles underneath, and the bit that is really missing here, and the bit that I think is where we pretty much feel all the responses that we get, is in the first layer. So we understand that the skin is a big organ, that it's we're told it's the biggest organ in the body, but directly underneath this isn't muscle, but is the layer that we call the adipose layer. Now, the adipose layer isn't just a layer of fat. Fat just doesn't hang around in the body. It has to be held in place. It has to be held in a scaffold. And so whenever we move around the body and we start to pick up tissue, the stuff that we're picking up, and we go, oh, this is our fat layer or what have you, and we demonize this layer, but actually it's more interesting and way more complex than that. So what I want to do is just to bring the worlds of fascia and fat and bodywork together and explore a little bit in this session about what is there and what's underneath our hands. So if I find skin anywhere in the body and I pick it up, I'm not just picking up skin. We have 5 layers to our skin, and that's another subject that's sort of fairly well covered. But directly underneath our skin, what we also have is we have this sort of layer of adipose tissue that spreads everywhere. This is my ticklish model. But if I pick this up, say around the shoulder blade, I might say to somebody, right, well, we have a restriction in the shoulder blade, but actually the restriction isn't necessarily being caused by muscle, joint, or impingement in that respect, even when there is clearly an injury here, but could be because this tissue here, this skin and the superficial fascia, is not moving around across the underlying deep fascia as it should. So skin from the underside of it, and we'll look at some pictures of it as well, has some fibres that are attached, and those fibres go all the way from the inside of the skin, and they travel down and they attach to the layer of the deep fascia, the sort of the white sort of sheety tissues that we see in some of the fascial dissections. And the connection is often poorly described, if it's described at all. So sometimes what we'll do is and this was a conversation for many years, we'd peel skin back in dissection, we'd see circles, and people would wonder what the circles were. Well, of course, the circles, as I just sort of realised in a Yahoo moment, they weren't there at all. What the circles were the attachment sites of the fibres of collagen that are running from the skin through the layer of the adipose and attaching down and becoming the deep fascia. So adipocytes, adipose cells, adipose tissue, is held and it's contained within a scaffold of collagen. And this collagen is exactly the same nature as the fibres that we will see that form up the deep fascia. As we come across the spine, we can see it's pinned down in here, and it's massively, it's very, very highly innervated. So when we even talk about things like sometimes back pain or thoracic pain or any of these restrictions, it's often these collagen fibers that are not moving around and having fluid moving through them that are creating the restriction. Fat cells, or adipocytes as they're called, don't proliferate as we get bigger. As we grow, they do, but once we're an adult, the number of fat cells you have in your body is relatively static and stable. The reason for that is that making cells is pretty expensive. Energetically, it's quite expensive and it takes some time. So fat cells instead just get bigger. They expand as energy gets put into them. So what this means is that they can expand pretty rapidly to accommodate the excess energy that you're chucking in, whether it be from the evolutionary process, whether it being a mammoth or a donut. It doesn't make any difference. The fat cells will expand in order to accommodate the increase of energy that's going into them. The fibres that go round and hold on to those fat cells don't increase in terms of the number of collagen fibres as well, but they expand because they're a sort of elastic tissue. And so what that means is if they expand rapidly, that's when we're going to start to see things like stretch marks. But where we can start to move around, and imagine that this skin and superficial tissue is like a wetsuit. If it's not able to move, then we're going to see a restriction in the area where it can't move. So I'll say that again. If an area around, say, a shoulder is pinned down for whatever reason, whether it be inflammation or scarring, then that area won't move either. So if I hold on to that, if I just pull this a little bit, I grab hold of that bit of fatty tissue and I ask my client to lift their arm up a little bit or just shrug their shoulder upwards, up and shrug it upwards. Shrug it. Okay. Yeah. So this is what's happening. I'm not holding on to this massively tightly, but the moment she moves, she's experiencing pain and she's experiencing restriction through the shoulder. And wherever we start to move around the body, this tissue should move. We should be able to pick this up. Now it's going to move less in certain areas, particularly around the lower back where this deeper tissues of the thoracolumbar fascia are going to come in. But essentially it should be able to be mobile and lifted. It's going to be softer around certain areas, particularly around the arms, but all the way down, whether it be the legs or whether it be the abdomen or the shoulders or even the neck, we should be able to pick up this skin and superficial fascia and move it around. If we can't, then we can pick it up and gently mobilize it. And as we'll do that, what we'll find is that it starts to move a bit more easily. We take our hands off, we leave it for a little while, we come back and we find that it moves a lot more straightforward. So this is an area here that I would probably want to work on. This is a lower back area. I'd want to get this area moved a little bit. The tissue that we refer to as the adipose cannot be adipose unless it has the collagen fibers that are wrapping themselves around and through it. And that then becomes something that we would refer to as superficial fascia. Now, we talk about the skin being the biggest organ of the body, but there's been a proposal that the adipose layer, the adipose tissue in here, is also an endocrine organ, which means that it responds to and produces hormone. In this instance, it's leptin. So therefore, we're seeing that this area, this tissue, is hormonal. It's dealing with, and responding to hormones. It's allowing fluid movement through it. It's allowing other signals to be transferred through it. It's and around it. It's part of our. It's going to allow the extracellular matrix, the fluids, the mucopolysaccharides, the ground substances, access to all of the rest of the body. So it's going to be a major component as far as fluid movement, lymph movement and everything else is concerned. So, but it's an area that really, when we study anatomy, we tend not to look at. You go into a book and you see the muscles and the fascia and the skin is referred to, and maybe somebody will say, well, this is adipose, but it's not studied as a functional layer. As manual therapists and touch therapists, this is the area that we're working on. This is the layer that we are working on. It's hugely innovated as far as nerve endings are concerned. So anything that's going on underneath our hands is taking any information from our hands to the spinal cord and up to the brain. And so we don't need to apply a huge amount of pressure in order for us to be able to communicate with the rest of the body through here. So it's a very interesting area to work and mobilize on. It's a really interesting area when we have restriction in a certain area to start to work on, lift and mobilize, and sort of lift and separate, and to go back and then see whether that's changed. And as I said to you, it's really an area that is just discarded when it comes, certainly when it comes to dissection. But I'm really fond of it. So what I want to do is show you some pictures of it as well, and hopefully that will get you an idea, and it'll give you the idea of why I like to use dissection and how it transforms quite often our understanding of what it is that we're doing, and what gives us a sort of inside picture of the structures that we're touching. It's very cool. So in certain areas, the superficial fascia is very different. Now we might think, oh well, there's always a good amount of tissue on the glute, and there is, but the deep fascia of the gluteus maximus is very different. It doesn't have that sort of sheet of fascia that we'll see, say, wrapping around the lower leg, or wrapping around the thoracolumbar fascia at the back. Instead, the superficial fascia blends straight down into the muscular area. So there isn't this sort of layer of sort of white fascia across the top. On the gluteus medius there is. So the gluteus medius is coming off the edge of the pelvis, and there's a layer of sort of aponeurotic tissue, and with a really strong connection of superficial fascia into it. Now I haven't really worked out what that is, but certainly it's an area that in this area is very, very interesting as far as loading is concerned. But just the same thing, so application wise, if I felt that somebody in the lower back was pretty stuck and tight, then what I would be wanting to do is to just really gently pick this skin and the superficial fascia, and understand that the fibers are going downwards into the muscle. So every time I pick up any kind of skin and superficial fascia and gently pull on it or create tension on it, I'm also creating pull and tension all the way down through into the next layer of deep fascia, and therefore also into whatever muscular tissue happens to be underneath my hands. This is a very therapeutic approach, and it really is interesting in terms of how we might feel the tissues change. When we talk about muscle knots, then the thing that we think is a muscle knot almost certainly isn't. And so what I want to do next time is get into muscle and what muscle is, and why I don't think there are such things as muscle knots, and what it is that we're experiencing and feeling. So hopefully we'll get into that, and we can cover that next time. So yeah, very cool. So as you can see, this is a tissue and area that I think it defines us as humans, and I think it's the key interface of where we work and what our work entails as manual therapists. We can't go deep into the body with our hands. This is it. So it's also the site of where lots of restriction in terms of movement is experienced by people. And even though other people might think that the muscle, deeper tissues are involved, and they may well be, this is an area to start where we don't even necessarily realise that the restriction is in there. So we will look at scarring and the effect of that tissue, and on this tissue as well, and what we can do about it at another time, because it's a really cool sort of area to dig into. But for now, understanding the power of this area and the effect on the whole body of working on it will have a huge impact on how you'll be able to recognize where pain or restrictions can be coming from, and really easily be able to address them. The questions sometimes get asked about the pressure that we use and whether it matters, and going through this tissue and what we're getting to the other side. And again, it's quite a deep subject and there's a lot to unpack with it. But the answer is maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. And I think some of it, is going to be superficial, but we will talk about that in the future. So the next video, I want to look at how the superficial fascia drops down, blends in with deeper fascia and muscle, and how we can affect it. And so for now, well, it's a big issue and a big tissue, and I think we've probably only just really scratched the surface. So, but if there's any questions you've got, if there's anything you're not sure about, if there's anything I've missed, which I almost certainly have, then please let me know. Questions are a big deal for me. I love getting questions. I love people asking stuff. It was always almost a disappointment in a class if I say any questions and people don't ask a question. So, it helps me to understand better what I'm saying when people are asking me things, and I'm responding in that way. So, and sometimes the questions I get will actually prompt me to go and research stuff. I may not be 100% sure of an answer, so I want to go and look at it, and it'll make another video, or even run a whole session. So I love that when that happens. So please don't be frightened to answer questions if there's anything you're not sure about. Also, please feel free to share this with anyone you think might be interested. Spread the word. It isn't a tissue that's looked at and talked about in terms of manual therapy or even movement, and so it's something we need to get out there and spread the word about. So hope you enjoyed that, and I look forward to seeing you next time.